This paper has been written with my colleagues there, Peter Berg, Christian Ibsen, and my graduate student, Salil Sapre. So this is a theoretical paper, and so I would say in tradition with industrial relations research, we were looking at what is happening in the US, the kind of traditional unions, the decline, but then also the alliances that are being built, the social movements, the worker centers, the recent strikes with the teachers. And so rather than trying to understand each of these phenomena separately, we're trying to build, in this paper, we're trying to build an integrated framework and setting up propositions. And our goal is to understand the existence and the organizational characteristics of the different forms of worker representation. So to situate our paper, we build on different debates on worker voice, debates that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, and we take out some of the key aspects to build our own framework. So there's this union decline, and so many people like Lucio Baccaro, Chris Howell, and so on are talking about how aspects of the environment or the context have an effect on unions, and especially in the negative sense. So for example, the neoliberalization, and so on. So kind of that environmental aspect, as I'll talk about later. Then there's also, let's say, maybe the more optimists that talk about union revitalization, again, very familiar to this audience. And some of the scholars now also start to talk about how do we organize the unorganized, what do we do when we have to organize migrant workers, women, people of color. So to what extent do we draw on social identity? And that's still in the beginning phases, but that's the second factor that for us will be very important in this framework. And then the third stream is people like Janice Fine and others that have done a lot of work on alternative forms of representation. And so looking at it more broadly, not just within industrial relations as the union as the main actor, but also looking at these other actors, such as worker-centered social movements, and so on. So in our approach, essentially, the starting point that we take on is that we say there's an incongruence between the form of representation. So here I talk about, we mean the traditional form in the US of legal, institutionalized collective bargaining on the one hand, and the environment and or the worker identity on the other hand. So there's two important factors here. The environment, how that affects this institutionalized form of collective bargaining, but then also for us this strong emergent factor of social identity and how that affects this institutionalized form of collective bargaining in the US. To do so, we use the logics theory as our lens. Again, it's about understanding now the characteristics of the forms of worker representation. And so particularly we draw on two types of logics. So the logic of influence is about the extent to which membership organizations have influence vis-a-vis external actors, such as the government or the employer. And the logic of membership, or the extent to which the organization does things in the interests of the members. So just to give a little bit more detail on these logics before I show our framework. So the logic of influence, again, if we think about the traditional trade union as it exists in the US, so it's the kind of the one main legal form of institutionalized collective bargaining. So the logic of influence, how does a union have influence vis-a-vis government or vis-a-vis the employer? It's these two realms of activities that come from that theory. So you can think about representation that goes mainly through collectively, being able to collectively bargain with the employer, and then also an element of control, or to what extent can you control the behavior of your members so you have a unified mandate towards your employer or government. Then the logic of membership, again, how do you maximize the interest of the members within the organization? Here there's two elements of activity that are important. Service, so how does a traditional union do that? By having this collective bargaining agreement. And then also participation, often with a traditional union, this is about indirect governance or elected union representatives. And of course, these two logics can be in dilemma with each other. So to what extent are you able to have this unified mandate towards the employer or the government, but at the same time, can you still hold your interests of your kind of diverse membership? So again, to our starting point, we have these two main elements, environment and social identity. So starting with the environment, so we're arguing that, and this is a debate that is well known within IR research, but we're showing again that there is an incongruence between the environment on the one hand and this collective, this institutionalized form of collective bargaining on the other hand. So many people have talked about how, for example, the legal environment has an effect on, makes it harder to unionize, the political environment, for example, with right-to-work states, the industrial environment, for example, subcontracting, and the employer hostility. So all these elements from the environment essentially make it harder to have influence vis-a-vis external actors, and so therefore they will affect these two realms of activities, as I mentioned before. So on the one hand, representing workers through collectively bargaining with the employer will become harder because of that environment, and also control of workers might become harder. For example, there's the decline of job control unionism. Say if you're in a firm that does a lot of subcontracting, as a union you won't have that control over the behavior of your workers anymore. So again, that was the first element, this incongruence with environment. Second element, incongruence with identity. So as the workforce demographic changes, but also kind of a heightened identity politics, and people mobilize not just in terms of economic identity, but also for social identity, there is this incongruence essentially between the traditional unions as we know them in the US, on the one hand, and the identity of the workers. And so that affects then those two activities that I mentioned before within the logic of membership. So services to workers will be affected in that workers might not want the same thing anymore because there's more diversity, they have different interests, and also participation of workers. So that indirect kind of governance that is in place with a lot of traditional unions in which union leaders are elected and then represent their members. Often, as literature has shown, there's a lack of black leadership, female leadership within unions. So there's again this incongruence essentially that is formed in terms of between the social identity of the workers and the traditional form of collective bargaining as we know it. So these are the starting points, and now we come to our framework. So in an abstract sense, you can see on the x-axis, you can go from congruence to incongruence. And so let's just start with quadrant one. Quadrant one, you're congruent with the environment and you're congruent with social identity. This essentially means you have an organization that is influential vis-a-vis external actors and has engaged members. If you go to quadrant two, you have an organization that has engaged members, so congruent with identity, but incongruent with environment, so less influential. It lacks influence. Quadrant three, this is an influential organization, so congruent with environment, but incongruent with social identity, so unengaged members. And then the worst case is quadrant four, essentially. There you have an organization with unengaged members and lacks influence. So now if we historicize that or contextualize that and take our point of departure, so the traditional trade union through ways of collective bargaining, this is now where we come to our quadrant. So if you are as a union in quadrant one, that means essentially that whatever you're doing, you're going to keep on doing it in terms of representation, in terms of control, in terms of service, and in terms of participation. So you're congruent with environment, congruent with identity. So this could be any type of local or national union that is essentially able to collectively bargain for its members in the interests of its members and has influence vis-a-vis the employer. But as we know in the US, this is a situation that is actually in decline, and so changes and incongruencies are happening. So when we go to quadrant two then, this is a situation in which unions, in which the members are engaged, so there's a strong congruence with their identity, but the environment becomes more and more hostile, so incongruence towards environment. So as on the y-axis, as you become more incongruent, what we are arguing, that there's likely to be changes to the logic of influence. In the x-axis, as you become more incongruent, there are likely to be changes to the logic of membership. So now looking at quadrant 2, more incongruent with environment, likely changes to logic of influence. So the proposition here is that rather than collectively bargaining with the employer, it will be more about political activism. And in terms of the control, the control will more be for the purposes then of mobilization around political action. So examples here would be nurses unions, teachers unions. So this was recently in West Virginia in the US. The teachers unions went on strike. And here you see Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, saying, because of what the Supreme Court is doing in the Janus case, you're going to see more and more and more of this. States that don't have collective bargaining, like Oklahoma or West Virginia, they're going to get more and more political. So this is a case with a strong social identity. These are teachers' strong identity, but the environment has become more and more incongruent, more and more hostile. The wages of the West Virginia teachers are now the 48th in the states, so on the bottom of the US. And so as a way of dealing with that, changes needed to happen to their logic of influence. And so rather than collectively bargaining, they're now taking it more up at a political level. Third quadrant, congruent with environment, but incongruent with social identity. So here we argue that there's likely to happen changes to the logic of membership. So in essence, the services will now focus more and more on the workers' social identity, and also in terms of participation, they're likely going to be more inclusive channels of participation. One example here could be bargaining for the common good, in which trade unions come together with community organizations and starting to think about how can we expand the scope of bargaining beyond wages and benefits. So trying to also be more inclusive, trying to really think beyond what a traditional collective bargaining agreement looks like. For example, adding in paid time off for migrant workers that need to deal with their migration status, centering much more racial justice in their demands, and so on. So thinking more broadly and encompassing kind of the social identity beyond just the one part of the workers. And then quadrant 4, of course, here we expect most changes to happen, changes in terms of logic of influence, as well as changes in terms of logic of membership, as that's an organization that is not influential and has unengaged members. So in essence, we expect changes to happen in representation, control, services, and participation. And this is also the quadrant in which it's most likely that these alternative forms of representation essentially come up. So here examples could be the Fight for 15 movement, of course, the incongruence with the environment. Fast food workers work in a very franchised industry, very hard to unionize. Incongruence with social identity. A lot of people of color, women, do not feel represented by any type of organization, so they come together. Maybe it started as a fight for $15 per hour, but have gone much broader, thinking in terms of social, racial justice, building alliances with the Black Lives Matter movement, and so on. Similarly, ROC, or the Restaurant Opportunity Center, you could think that they came out from that quadrant in which restaurants, very hard to unionize, small workplaces, also consist of many migrant workers. And so what these organizations do is try to kind of build this new type of organization that does things differently in terms of representation, control, participation, and service. So again, services much more, not just in terms of economic, but also in terms of what about immigrant rights, justice, and so on. Participation becomes much more direct. Representation is also much more direct, settling directly with the employer, negotiating with them. And control becomes to a certain extent harder. Control in Fight for 15, how will you control that your members do go to mobilize? With ROC, one of the elements that they put in is, say, you have to be present or part of 3 kind of mobilizations, and then you can become member. That's one way of controlling. But so this is all just to say that these realms of activities are likely to change because of incongruences that were created with the environment and social identity. So that's essentially the first step, or the first kind of phase from our framework. So incongruences are created, and so changes are likely to happen. The second phase is once you implement or put in place these changes, then that organization becomes quadrant 1 and becomes essentially kind of the optimal. If they do that, they become the optimal, come in an optimal state, and these changes then become part of their repertoire, essentially. So just to conclude, some implications for theory papers. So as far as we know, this is a first attempt, essentially, of thinking about a more integrated framework as to how to understand these different forms of worker representation, rather than looking at them one by one and thinking about each one of them has their own logics, so more integrative. We also put forward that element of social identity as a kind of a new emergent factor within IR, but in addition to that, we do link it to the organizational properties of the organization. So to what extent, if you tailor your collective bargaining agreement to the different social identities, are you still able to form a unified mandate towards your employer? What are the trade-offs there? There's also some questions about alliance building here. To what extent do you build alliance to have influence vis-a-vis these external actors, so for the influence? To what extent do you build alliances for that social identity? And are there, again, dilemmas between those two? While this is mainly focused on the US, in our paper we also have some examples on how to apply that framework to countries outside the US. And then finally, of course, in terms of labor power and implications, there's always the question, if you go outside the main legal institutionalized channel of collective bargaining, of trade unionism, especially in the US, what is the sustainability, essentially, of these other organizations, often organizations like ROC, like Fight for 15, and so on. So just to conclude, we try to kind of reconceptualize how we think about worker representations and these different forms. We argue that we need to bring into the analysis social identity, and we think about it in terms of incongruences. And so as a result of these incongruences, what we would suspect is that that there's different things that could happen. Either unions restructure internally, they start to build external alliances, or actually new forms of representation emerge. Thank you.